Hi, Steve Sandweiss here with a quick explanation for this sample LSAT problem. It would simply take too long to set up and work through an entire logic game, so instead I'm going to choose a sample problem from one of the two logical reasoning sections of the LSAT, which account for half of your total score. Many of the skills tested in the game section are also relevant to the logical reasoning sections and vice versa. Each of the two logical reasoning sections contains about 24 short arguments, many of which could be more logically persuasive than they currently are. This particular question asks us to strengthen the argument. And one of the best ways to strengthen any argument is to first identify the argument's assumption and then locate an answer choice that validates or strengthens that assumption. Think of an assumption as a statement that needs to be true in order for the argument to be more logically persuasive, but which is currently missing from the argument. In other words, the assumption is something that we're simply taking for granted rather than explicitly stating. And the primary job of an argument's assumption is to seamlessly connect the argument's evidence with its conclusion. So in looking at this particular argument, we want to pay attention to the type of reasoning employed. When we look at the argument's evidence, it shows us that there is some kind of relationship between frequent snoring and throat damage. This is indicated to us by the phrase, significantly more likely to, in the wording of the argument. That language tells us that the argument is asserting some kind of correlation, some sort of two-way relationship between these variables. What it doesn't tell us, however, is whether snoring is responsible for throat damage, or if throat damage is responsible for frequent snoring, or if perhaps both of these symptoms are somehow caused by a third unknown factor. However, when we look at the argument's conclusion, we can see that it is asserting a causal relationship between snoring and throat damage, right? That somehow snoring is responsible for throat damage. So in comparing the argument's evidence with its conclusion, right, the evidence is looking at some sort of two-way relationship between snoring and throat damage, while the argument's conclusion is only showing us a one-way relationship between snoring and throat damage. So in order to make this argument more logically persuasive, we're going to need to insert an assumption that tells us that throat damage is not responsible for snoring. Now, if we think about our argument, the evidence tells us that there's a relationship between snoring and throat damage. We're assuming that throat damage doesn't cause snoring, so that makes it more reasonable to conclude that snoring is responsible for throat damage. Remember, with the strengthening question, the job of the correct answer is to validate the argument's assumption. So when you look over at the 5 answer choices, you're looking for something that reaffirms the idea that throat damage is not responsible for snoring, and you can see it right there in choice E. Now you're ready for law school. Okay, perhaps not quite ready. But what you're seeing here is an example of the kinds of skills you're going to need in order to achieve a top score on the LSAT and get admission to a top law school. So please let us know if we can be of any further help in preparing you to gain admission to the law school of your choice. Thanks.